Shockingly, for an artist as storied and heavily bootlegged as Dylan, it took until the 15th installment of the bootleg series for there to be any close examination of what's probably the most mysterious and elusive period of his career. For unlike his contemporaries at the end of the 60s, Dylan ended his most prolific decade on a question mark. At the peak of his popularity, he retreated from public life and began making records which sounded nothing like his folk albums of the early 60s, or his trio of rock records from the mid-60s. These albums were more insular and sparse, and felt completely out of step with the popular trends defining rock music in the latter half of the decade. So, traveling through 1967 through 1969 attempts to add a slight amount of clarity to the era by framing these songs as Dylan's Nashville period, insinuating that the major defining quality of these recordings is that they were recorded in the heart of country music and that Dylan was aiming to gear his sound toward a more country rock direction. Now, this assumption for the most part is misleading, because of the 4 albums Dylan recorded in Nashville, only 1969's Nashville Skyline really could be considered a country album. The other album recorded during this era, which is 1967's John Wesley Harding, wore its country influence more as an aesthetic, using country more as a synonym for western or cowboy. At its heart, it was still mostly a rock record, with tracks like Dear Landlord, Drifter's Escape, and All Along the Watchtower being very easily adaptable to straightforward rock, as evidenced by Jimi Hendrix's reinterpretation of All Along the Watchtower only a few months later into the iconic rock staple that it became. Still, though, there was definitely an influence which made itself evident on these albums, if only through the fact that the backing musicians and the record producer Dylan was working with at the time were more acclimated toward recording country music than rock music. This becomes readily apparent on the John Wesley Harding outtakes, which open the proceedings. At the start, it sounds like the backing musicians are prepared to record an album similar to Blonde on Blonde, which was the first album Dylan recorded in Nashville, and is not represented here. Looser interpretations of Drifter's Escape and I Dreamed I Saw St. Augustine can at times recall the feel of tracks like Stuck Inside of Mobile with the Memphis Blues Again, or Visions of Johanna.
I dreamed I saw St. Augustine.
Only in the interim between the albums, Dylan shifted gears as a songwriter, and he's delivering these musicians material which is born out of the more rustic, laid-back Americana, which defined the Basement Tape sessions he'd been recording with the band in Woodstock earlier that same year. So, in turn, as the sessions progress, the musicians slip back into a more comfortable and familiar country feel for them, which in turn affects what the finished arrangements of these songs turn into.
John Wesley Harding was a friend.
The John Wesley Harding outtakes are the most revelatory recordings in the set, and because they come at the front of the whole package, it means that this installment of the bootleg series kinda plays its best hand too quickly. Afterwards, we move into the outtakes from the Nashville Skyline sessions, which took place 14 months later. Coming after the John Wesley Harding material, the listener gets the sense that this time around, Dylan knew he was going into the studio with a country music producer and with country music backing musicians, and as such, knowingly tried to deliver a set of material which would better suit their natural sensibilities. It still doesn't explain why Dylan's voice shifted from its trademark nasally quality into this odd crooner thing he was going for.
But I must have been mad. I never knew what I had.
But it does at least explain why he moved in a more country direction musically. There aren't as many revelations to be found here, though. Most of the outtakes sound only marginally different from the finished masters, almost to the point where the less dedicated Dylan listener would probably have a hard time differentiating between the rough takes featured here and the finished takes that made it onto Nashville Skyline itself.
Love me of mine. Love that country pie.
There's the bluesy Western Road, which didn't make the final track listing of the album, and it's not some Lost Dylan masterpiece.
And I'm going to Chicago.
The rest of the set anchors itself around the aborted sessions for what was in theory meant to be a collaborative duet album between Bob Dylan and Johnny Cash. Now, Johnny Cash, of course, was at the top of his game at the time. He had just come off the massive success of his Folsom Prison concert and was only a few days away from repeating that success with his performance at San Quentin. Long the admirer and friend of Dylan, the decision somewhere was made for the two music legends to record an album together. Yet, it becomes immediately apparent on playback of these tapes that the weak link here is Dylan himself, who sounds completely detached from practically all of the performances. He contributes little more than a harmony vocal here and there, and whenever Cash calls upon him to take the reins and sing a verse, he quickly retreats and claims he doesn't remember any of the words.
Sing it, Bob.
Cash really is leading the proceedings, and ends up using most of his energy trying to guide Dylan through the performances, until it becomes clear by the third disc that he's decided it's no longer worth it, and just decides to run through the material with his band and let Dylan try to find his own way through the performances.
Verse?
In the end, the only remnant which saw release at the time was a re-recording of Dylan's Girl from North Country, which served as the opening to Nashville Skyline. Listening back to these tapes, it's pretty clear to see why this album was abandoned. Had it been released back in 1969, it could have potentially derailed the resurgence that Cash's career was experiencing at the time, and it only would have further frustrated Dylan fans who were waiting to see him take back the cultural reins after being appointed the unwilling spokesman of a generation. So, all told, how does the 15th Bootleg Series entry stack up? Well, about as well as Another Self-Portrait or Trouble No More. Which is to say that the success of the Bootleg Series lives or dies based off of the period in Dylan's career that it's mining its material from. And this just simply wasn't one of Dylan's greatest eras. Certainly wasn't one of his worst either, but definitely one of his most divisive. When it's brilliant, it's brilliant, and when it's uninspired, it's uninspired. I think a set dedicated solely to the John Wesley Harding sessions would have been a more worthwhile endeavor, but the scarcity of available recordings from that era probably would have made that impossible. It does shed a little bit of light on this mysterious chapter in Dylan's discography, but it doesn't necessarily answer any questions about it either.